I used to think the strongest people I knew were the ones who never complained, the ones who always smiled, the ones who kept showing up, no matter what life threw at them. It took me a long time to realize I had it backwards. Sometimes the strongest people are simply the ones who have been carrying everything alone. And sometimes what they need isn't advice. They just need someone who isn't in a hurry to leave. The older I get, the more I realize how much time we spend trying to fix each other. Someone tells us they're struggling, and before they've even finished speaking, we're already searching for the right answer. Maybe it's because we care. Maybe because seeing someone we love in pain makes us uncomfortable. Either way, we've become very good at responding, but not always very good at listening. A friend of mine taught me that lesson years ago. Not by giving me advice, just by telling me about one rainy afternoon he never forgot. His name was Thomas. If you ever met him, you'd probably like him right away. Not because he was especially funny or charming. He wasn't. Thomas was the kind of man people quietly depended on. If someone's fence had blown over after a storm, Thomas would be there with his toolbox. If an elderly neighbor needed a ride to a doctor's appointment, he'd make time. If a friend's truck refused to start on a freezing January morning, Thomas was usually the first call. He never made a big deal out of helping people. He'd just shrug and say, "If I can help, why wouldn't I?" For most of his life, he believed caring for someone meant solving whatever problem they had. It seemed like a good way to live, until one ordinary afternoon showed him something different. Thomas once told me that the first thing he remembers about that day isn't the conversation. It isn't even the friend he met. It's the little brass bell hanging above the coffee shop door. Every time someone walked in, it gave off a soft, familiar ring. Nothing dramatic, just enough to remind you another person had stepped inside. It had been raining most of the afternoon. Not the kind of rain that floods streets, just the steady kind that leaves your jacket damp and the sidewalks shining. When Thomas walked in, the barista looked up and smiled. The usual. He smiled back. She already knew the answer. A few minutes later, his coffee arrived in the same brown ceramic mug she'd been serving him in for years. He wrapped both hands around it. Before taking the first sip, his phone buzzed. Then another notification. An email. A voicemail. By the time he looked back at his coffee, the steam was gone. Thomas laughed when he told me that part. I hated drinking cold coffee back then. Then he paused. So I guess that's where the story really begins. Just as Thomas reached for his mug, someone called his name. "Thomas?" He turned around. It was Ethan. The two of them hadn't seen each other in almost 8 years. Thomas told me he couldn't remember what Ethan was wearing that day. He couldn't remember who stood up first. But he remembered the hug. The kind men give each other after enough years have passed. Brief. A little awkward. Completely genuine. They sat down together. At first, the conversation went exactly the way you'd expect. Work, family, old friends, a few stories neither of them had told in years. They laughed more than once. And every now and then, they both found themselves watching the rain instead of looking at each other. Thomas smiled when he told me this. "You know something about men our age. We can spend 20 minutes talking without saying the one thing we actually came to say." A little while later, the coffee shop grew quieter. The last customer near the window packed up and left. The little bell above the door rang one more time. Then everything settled. The espresso machine stopped. The music faded into the background. Outside, rain tapped softly against the glass. Inside, neither man seemed in any hurry. Thomas looked over at Ethan. Ethan was staring out the window. His coffee sat untouched. After a long silence, he finally spoke. I've been... He stopped, looked down into his cup, then tried again. I've just been tired. Thomas looked at me when he reached this part of the story. He smiled. You know what the old me would have done? I would have started fixing things. Take a vacation. Work less. Maybe it's time for a change. I had a solution ready before the conversation had even begun. He looked back toward the rain in the memory. But that afternoon, for some reason, I didn't. I just looked at him and asked one question. What happened? Thomas told me he expected Ethan to answer right away. He didn't. Instead, he wrapped both hands around his coffee and kept looking through the rain-speckled window. Neither of them spoke. The silence didn't feel uncomfortable. It felt earned. Somewhere behind the counter, someone was steaming milk. The front door opened. The little brass bell rang once. A young couple walked in laughing, shook the rain from their jackets, and found a table near the back. Life kept moving around them. Their conversation didn't have to. A minute or so later, Ethan finally spoke. Have you ever done something without knowing why? Thomas frowned a little. What do you mean? Ethan gave a tired smile. I get home. I pull into the driveway. I turn the engine off. Then he shrugged, and I just sit there. Thomas didn't interrupt. I tell myself I'll go inside in a minute. But somehow, 10 minutes go by. Sometimes longer. He let out a quiet laugh. One day, my wife knocked on the truck window because she thought something had happened. He smiled when he said it, but it wasn't the kind of smile that hides happiness. It was the kind people wear when they're trying to make something heavy sound lighter than it really is. Thomas admitted something to me years later. He said that was the exact moment he almost interrupted. He almost told Ethan that everyone gets burned out. He almost suggested taking a few days off. He almost started fixing the problem. That had always been his instinct. If someone brought him a broken chair, he looked for a screwdriver. If someone brought him a broken day, he looked for advice. But that afternoon, something told him to wait. So he did. Ethan took another breath. You know what's strange? Thomas shook his head. I'm surrounded by people. Customers. Employees. My family. I talk all day. He looked down into his coffee, but I can't remember the last time. I felt like I could actually say everything that was on my mind. He laughed softly. I don't even know where I'd start. Thomas told me something that surprised me. He said he couldn't remember every sentence Ethan spoke after that. Memory doesn't work that way. Years pass. Words fade. What stays is how someone made you feel. He remembered the pauses. The way Ethan kept turning the coffee cup with both hands. The way he stared out the window before every difficult sentence. The way his shoulders seemed just a little lower by the time he finished speaking. Those were the things Thomas had never forgot. After another long silence, Ethan finally looked at him. Can I tell you something that's probably going to sound stupid? Thomas smiled. I've heard worse. Ethan nodded. I spend most of my life trying to convince everyone I'm okay. My wife, my kids, the people I work with. He paused again. I got pretty good at it. Then he looked back down. So good that I think I started believing it myself. The waitress stopped by their table. You gentlemen doing okay? Thomas smiled. We're good. She looked at their cups. Can I warm those up for you? Thomas glanced at Ethan. Ethan glanced at Thomas. Almost at the same time. They both smiled and shook their heads. No thanks. We're fine. The waitress gathered the empty dessert plate and quietly walked away. Thomas laughed when he told me that part. I don't know why I still remember her asking. Then he thought about it for a moment. Maybe because neither of us wanted to interrupt what was happening. The rain had almost stopped. Thin streaks of sunlight were beginning to break through the clouds. People outside walked a little slower now. A man crossed the street carrying groceries. A little girl jumped over a puddle, while her mother pretended not to notice. Thomas said that life looked exactly the same outside the window, but somehow it didn't feel the same anymore. Then Ethan said something Thomas carried with him for years. I don't think I needed anyone to fix anything. He smiled. I think I just needed someone to stay. Not someone with answers, not someone with advice, just someone who wasn't already thinking about leaving. Thomas looked at me after telling that part. He smiled the way people do when they finally understand something years after it happened. You know, I've helped a lot of people in my life. I've repaired fences, engines, broken shelves. He looked down at his hands, but that afternoon, I don't think I fixed a single thing. He looked back at me, and somehow, it was one of the most meaningful afternoons I've ever had. When they finally stood up to leave, the rain had ended. The sidewalks were still wet. The air smelled clean. Ethan zipped up his jacket. They walked out together. Just before getting into his truck, Ethan turned around. He smiled. A real smile this time. You know, it's been a long time since I've talked that much. Thomas laughed. I didn't say very much. I know. Ethan nodded. I think that's why. He climbed into his truck, started the engine, raised one hand through the windshield. Then he drove away. Thomas stood there for another minute before walking back inside. His coffee was still sitting on the table, cold. He picked it up, took a sip, then smiled to himself. I used to think cold coffee meant I'd been too busy. He looked at me. That was the first cup that got cold. Because I had finally learned how to stay. Thomas told me something that stayed with me. He said the strange thing about that afternoon was that nothing seemed to change. The next morning, he opened the store like always. He answered emails, helped unload a delivery truck, spent 20 minutes fixing a display shelf that refused to stay level. Life moved on. If someone had asked him that week whether meeting Ethan had changed him, he probably would have said no. Looking back, I think real change rarely announces itself. It waits, quietly, until life gives us another chance to respond differently. That chance came about a week later. It was a Friday night. The whole family happened to be home. His wife had made lasagna. His son was talking about work. The television was still on in the next room, turned down low enough that no one was really watching it. Emma sat across from him. She wasn't saying much. Thomas told me that years earlier, he probably wouldn't have noticed. Not because he didn't love his daughter, but because he had gotten so used to listening for words that he'd stopped noticing silence. About halfway through dinner, Emma looked up. Dad? Thomas smiled. Yeah? She hesitated, then looked back down at her plate. I had a fight with Claire today. Thomas told me he couldn't remember whether Claire was a classmate or someone from Emma's soccer team. He laughed. I guess that part never mattered. What he remembered was how quietly she said it. The old Thomas already had an answer. Ask what happened. Figure out who's right. Offer advice. Help solve it. He could almost hear those words lining up in his head. Instead, he pulled his chair just a little closer and said, Tell me about it. Nothing more. Emma started talking, not in order. She jumped from one part of the story to another. She remembered yesterday, before she remembered this morning. She stopped halfway through one thought, because another memory interrupted it. Thomas never tried to organize the story for her. He didn't hurry her. Every now and then, he'd simply ask, "And then what happened?" Or, "How did that make you feel?" Most of the time, he just listened. Thomas smiled when he reached this part. "I don't know how long we sat there. 20 minutes. Maybe 40. I honestly couldn't tell you." Then he laughed. "The only thing I know is that Emma's tea went cold." He paused, and for some reason, I noticed. When Emma finished, she didn't ask what she should do. She didn't ask if she was right. She just sat there for another moment. Then she stood up, picked up her plate, started walking toward the kitchen. Halfway there, she turned around. "Dad?" Thomas looked up. She smiled. Not a big smile, just enough. "I think I'll be okay." Then she disappeared around the corner. Thomas looked at me for a long moment before he spoke again. "You know, I used to think a good conversation ended with an answer." He smiled. "I'm not so sure anymore." A little later, he added something else, very quietly. "I wish I'd learned this sooner." I didn't ask what he meant. I already knew. He was thinking about his father, about conversations that ended too quickly, about evenings that could have lasted a little longer. After a while, he looked out the window and smiled. "But I'm grateful. I still have time." That was the last thing Thomas ever told me about Ethan. He never said whether they met again. He never told me if Ethan's life got easier. Maybe he didn't know. Maybe it wasn't the important part. Some stories aren't remembered because of how they end. They're remembered because they quietly change the way we see the people we love. Driving home that night, I left the radio off. The streets were quiet. Lights glowed behind living room windows. A man was watering flowers on his front porch. A little boy chased his dog across a front yard. In one house, I could see a family still sitting around the dinner table. From the outside, they all looked ordinary. And maybe they were. But I couldn't stop thinking. Every house has a conversation happening in it. Some have already been spoken. Some are still waiting. When I got home, I made myself a cup of coffee. I set it on the kitchen table. Then I picked up my phone and called my dad. We didn't talk about anything important. We talked about the weather, about a neighbor he'd run into that morning, about whether he'd finally gotten around to fixing the porch light. Nothing extraordinary, just a conversation. When we hung up, my coffee had gone cold. I looked down at the mug and smiled. For the first time, I didn't mind. I still think about Thomas every now and then. Not because of something wise he said, and not because everything worked out perfectly. I think about him because of a cold cup of coffee. Funny how ordinary things can become reminders. Now, every once in a while, when my coffee gets cold, I catch myself wondering why. Was I distracted? Or was I sitting with someone who needed a little more time? Maybe that's the better reason to let a cup of coffee grow cold. Because long after we forget the words, people rarely forget how it felt to be heard. Thank you for spending this time with me. I'll see you again next time.